The spaghetti hit Dean Martin's head with enough force to spray marinara across his white tuxedo shirt, and for 3 seconds, nobody in the Oakland Coliseum backstage corridor moved, because Frank Sinatra had just thrown an entire plate of pasta at the man who'd been his best friend for 40 years. Wait, because what happened in the 6 nights between that moment and Dean walking off the tour forever would reveal something nobody wanted to admit. The king of cool was already gone, and Frank had just realized he'd been performing next to a ghost. The plate clattered onto the concrete floor, spinning once before settling upside down near Dean's patent leather shoes. Red sauce dripped from Dean's silver hair down onto the lapel of his jacket, each drop landing with a quiet tap that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. Frank's chest was heaving, his hands still frozen in the throwing position, and the catering staff who'd been setting up dinner service had backed against the opposite wall like they were trying to disappear into the cinder blocks. Dean didn't wipe his face. He didn't look at Frank. He turned slowly, carefully, like a man testing whether his legs would still hold him, and walked toward the exit that led to the parking lot. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady and measured, and nobody called after him. The door opened, letting in a rush of cold March air that carried the smell of rain and exhaust fumes, and then it closed again with a soft click that somehow felt final. One of the backup singers, a woman named Carolyn, who'd been with the tour since the first night in Detroit, 3 weeks earlier, would later tell her daughter that watching Dean Martin walk away, covered in spaghetti, was like watching someone's soul leave their body while they were still breathing. She said his shoulders didn't slump, and his walk didn't falter, but something about the way he moved made it clear he was already somewhere else, somewhere none of them could follow. Frank stood there for another 10 seconds, staring at the closed door, before he turned and punched the brick wall, hard enough that 2 of his knuckles split open. He didn't make a sound. He just wrapped his hand in a white napkin that immediately turned pink, walked past the overturned plate, and disappeared into his dressing room. The lock clicked from inside. Notice something important here, because the spaghetti wasn't really about the spaghetti. What you need to understand is that 2 hours earlier, Dean Martin had stood on the stage of the Oakland Coliseum arena in front of 14,000 people and forgotten the words to "Everybody Loves Somebody." Not just stumbled over a line or missed a verse, he'd stopped singing entirely in the middle of the second chorus, his mouth still open, the orchestra playing behind him for 4 full bars before the conductor realized Dean wasn't coming back in. The audience had started quiet, confused, waiting for this to be part of the act. Dean Martin was famous for seeming drunk on stage, even when he was stone sober, for the carefully crafted looseness that made every show feel like you'd stumbled into a party where anything could happen. But this wasn't that. This was a 70-year-old man in a tuxedo, standing under white spotlight, with absolutely no idea what came next, and you could see it in his eyes even from the cheap seats. Someone in the front section had shouted, "Loader," thinking maybe Dean was singing, and they just couldn't hear him over the band. The shout caught on, spreading through the first 10 rows like wildfire, hundreds of voices chanting "Loader, Loader, Loader," in a rhythm that matched the drum kit. Dean had blinked, turned slowly to look at the audience, as if he'd just remembered they were there, and then he'd smiled. That old dino smile, the one that sold 1 million records, the one that made 3 generations of women weak in the knees. He'd raised one hand in a little wave, pointed finger gun style at someone in the 4th row, and walked off stage while the band kept playing. The stage manager, a thin man named Robert who'd worked Vegas showrooms for 30 years and thought he'd seen everything, had been waiting in the wings with a glass of water and a towel. Dean walked right past him without looking, went straight to his dressing room, and locked the door. Robert stood there holding the water glass, watching condensation run down the sides, and later he'd tell the promoter that Dean's eyes had been completely empty. Not sad, not embarrassed, not angry, just empty, like someone had reached in and scooped out whatever made Dean Martin Actually Dean Martin, and left behind a very expensive suit walking around on autopilot. Frank had pounded on the dressing room door for 5 minutes, his voice getting louder and rougher with each sentence, demanding Dean come out and explain what the hell that was. Sammy Davis Jr. had tried to pull Frank away, suggesting they give Dean some space. Maybe he was feeling sick. Maybe something was wrong that they didn't know about. Frank had rounded on Sammy so fast, the smaller man actually flinched, and Frank's voice when he spoke was cold enough to frost glass. Something's wrong. Yeah, something's wrong. The something that's wrong is that Dean doesn't give a damn anymore. He's been sleepwalking through this whole tour, showing up late, forgetting lyrics. And now he just walked off in the middle of a song in front of 14,000 people who paid $80 a ticket to see the Rat Pack, not whatever the hell that was out there. Sammy hadn't argued. He just looked at the locked door with an expression that later, when people tried to describe it, they'd say looked like grief. The second show that night had gone on without Dean. Frank had come out solo, made some joke about Dino getting lost on the way to the bathroom, and launched into My Way with an intensity that felt less like performance and more like a declaration of war against the entire concept of giving up. The audience had loved it, given him a standing ovation, and Frank had smiled and bowed and probably wanted to put his fist through every single face beaming up at him from the darkness beyond the stage lights. That's when the catering had been delivered. Standard Backstage rider stuff, pasta, salad, bread, some kind of chicken. Frank had come off stage, still riding the adrenaline of performing Angry, found Dean's dressing room door finally unlocked, walked in without knocking, and discovered Dean sitting on the couch eating a sandwich like nothing had happened. Just sitting there in his undershirt and tuxedo pants, sauce from the sandwich dripping onto his bare chest, watching a basketball game on the tiny TV someone had brought in. Stop for a second and picture this from Frank's perspective. Because this is the moment everything crystallized into something he couldn't ignore anymore. Here's Dean Martin, the smoothest man who ever lived, the guy who made cool look effortless, sitting in a backstage dressing room, covered in sandwich debris, watching the Lakers, while Frank Sinatra had just spent 90 minutes covering for his complete professional collapse in front of a sold-out arena. And Dean looked up when Frank walked in, smiled that same empty smile, and said, "Hey, Pally, good show." Frank had grabbed the plate of spaghetti off the catering cart in the hallway. He'd walked back into Dean's dressing room. Dean had still been smiling, mouth full of sandwich, and Frank had thrown the entire thing directly at his head from maybe 6 feet away. The pasta had hit with a wet slap that echoed off the cinder block walls. Marinara sauce exploded across Dean's face, his hair, his undershirt. A meatball bounced off his shoulder and rolled under the couch, and Dean had just sat there, the smile slowly fading from his face, like someone turning down a dimmer switch. And then he'd stood up very carefully, very slowly, walked past Frank without making eye contact, picked up his tuxedo jacket from where it was hanging on the back of a chair, put it on over his sauce-covered undershirt, and walked out. Listen to what happened next, because this is where you start to see how deep the fracture really went. Dean Martin didn't come back to the hotel that night. Nobody knew where he was. His room key never got used. His bed never got slept in. The tour manager called every hospital in Oakland, thinking maybe Dean had collapsed somewhere, had a stroke, something medical that would explain everything. Nothing. Dean Martin had vanished. He showed up the next morning at 7 a.m. in the hotel lobby, wearing the same tuxedo, still stained with dried marinara, looking like he'd been walking around Oakland all night. The night desk clerk, a young kid named Marcus, who was studying hospitality management at Berkeley and working overnight shifts to pay for it, later wrote about the encounter in his senior thesis. He said Dean had stood at the front desk for a full minute, just looking at the lobby, Christmas lights that were still up even though it was March, and when Marcus asked if he needed anything, Dean had said, do you know what time it is in Italy right now?" Marcus had done the math. "About 4 in the afternoon, I think, Mr. Martin." Dean had nodded like this information contained some profound truth, thanked Marcus very politely, and gone upstairs to his room. An hour later, the tour manager got a call. Dean would do the remaining 6 shows. After that, he was going home. Wait, because here's what nobody knew at the time. What only came out years later when the road manager finally talked to a reporter from People magazine after both Frank and Dean were gone. The reason Dean agreed to finish the 6 shows had nothing to do with professionalism or loyalty or contract obligations. It was because Frank sent Sammy to Dean's room with an apology that wasn't really an apology at all. Sammy had knocked softly, and when Dean opened the door, showered now, dressed in a bathrobe, looking about 100 years old, in the morning light, Sammy had said, "Frank wants you to know he's sorry about the spaghetti, but he's not sorry about being angry." Dean had smiled then, a real smile this time, and it was sad enough that Sammy had to look away. Tell Frank, "I'm sorry too. Sorry I'm not who he needs me to be anymore." The next 6 nights were professional torture, disguised as entertainment. Dean showed up on time, knew all his lyrics, hit all his marks, smiled at all the right moments, and was completely, totally, utterly absent. He was a hologram of Dean Martin, a perfectly executed impression of himself, and everyone watching knew it, but pretended they didn't, because the alternative was acknowledging that something precious and irreplaceable was ending right in front of them. Frank and Dean didn't speak off stage. Not in the hallways, not in the dressing rooms, not during sound check. They spoke on stage, their scripted banter and planned jokes, and the second the curtain came down, they went in opposite directions like magnets, with the same pole facing each other. Sammy tried to mediate, got nowhere, eventually stopped trying and just looked sadder with each passing show. Remember the countdown I mentioned earlier? 6 shows. Chicago, 2 nights. Milwaukee, 1 night. Minneapolis, 1 night. St. Paul, 1 night. The tour was supposed to run until May. 29 cities, 68 shows. The biggest reunion tour in entertainment history. On March 13, 1988, after the final St. Paul show, Dean Martin's personal assistant issued a statement. Mr. Martin was withdrawing from the tour due to a kidney ailment that required immediate attention and rest. 3 days later, Dean showed up at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, looking healthier than he had in months, taking meetings, having dinner with friends, and when someone asked him about his kidney problems, he grinned and said, "Frank sent me one of his kidneys, but I don't know whose body he took it from, so I figured I better not use it." The real reason Dean quit, according to the road manager who'd been there for all of it, was that Frank and Sammy had spent the entire tour pulling pranks like they were still 25 years old and invincible. Firecrackers in hotel corridors at 3 a.m., replacing Dean's shaving cream with whipped cream, switching the contents of his suitcase with women's clothing. The kind of stuff that might have been funny in 1962 when the Rat Pack was young and the world was their playground, and Vegas had just been invented. But it was 1988. Dean's son had been dead for less than a year. Captain Dean, Paul Martin, F-4 Phantom pilot, killed in a training exercise over California in March 1987, when his jet disappeared into the San Bernardino Mountains, and all they ever found was wreckage, scattered across 4 square miles of wilderness. Dean had flown out to identify what little remained, had stood in a military hangar looking at twisted metal and his son's flight jacket, and something inside him had simply stopped working. Frank knew this. Sammy knew this. Everyone knew this. But Frank Sinatra's way of dealing with grief was to perform through it, to fight it, to refuse to let it win. And he couldn't understand why Dean wouldn't do the same. And Dean's way of dealing with grief was to retreat so far inside himself that he could barely find his way back out to sing a song, much less laugh at firecrackers in a hallway. The The spaghetti was Frank saying, "I need you to be here with me." The walking away was Dean saying, "I can't." Notice what happens after Dean leaves the tour, because this is where the real devastation sets in. Frank and Dean Martin don't speak for 8 months. 8 months of silence between two men who'd been inseparable for 4 decades, who'd made each other's careers possible, who knew each other's weaknesses and strengths better than they knew their own. 8 months during which Frank reportedly called Dean's house 17 times and hung up before anyone answered. 8 months during which Dean told anyone who asked that he was fine, Frank was fine, everything was fine, and smiled that empty smile that made people want to cry. They finally reconciled at a dinner that Frank arranged through intermediaries, a small place in Beverly Hills, where they'd gone 1,000 times before. Just the two of them in a private room with white tablecloths and candles, and a waiter who knew to leave them alone. What happened during that dinner depends on who you ask, but multiple sources confirm that at some point Frank and Dean started throwing bread rolls at each other, laughing like maniacs. And when the waiter finally stuck his head in to check on them, both men had tears running down their faces, and neither one could say whether it was from laughing or crying. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995. He was 78 years old. He'd spent the last 7 years of his life, mostly alone in his Beverly Hills home, watching westerns on television, refusing most visitors, slowly fading like a photograph left in sunlight. Frank Sinatra was among the last people to see him conscious. He'd visited 2 days before Christmas, sat by Dean's bed, held his hand, and reportedly said, "You know what your problem always was, Pally. You never learned how to hate anything enough to fight it." Dean had opened his eyes, focused on Frank's face with what seemed like tremendous effort, and whispered something that Frank never told anyone, not even his wife Barbara, not even his kids. Whatever Dean said, it made Frank squeeze his hand so hard. The nurses were worried he'd hurt him, and when Frank left the house that day, he sat in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes before he could make himself turn the key. The funeral was small. Frank sat in the front row and didn't cry until they started playing "Everybody Loves Somebody," and then he cried so hard his daughter had to help him out of the church. Someone asked him later what he was going to remember most about Dean Martin, and Frank said, "The way he could make you feel like the most important person in the world just by looking at you, and how he stopped looking at anyone after his boy died." If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. And if you want to know what really happened the night Frank sent Dean those firecrackers in Detroit, the night that might have actually started this whole collapse, tell me in the comments, because that's a story that'll make you understand why Dean couldn't laugh anymore. The spaghetti stains never completely came out of that white tuxedo jacket. Dean had it dry cleaned 3 times, but you could still see the ghost of red sauce near the collar if you looked carefully. He never wore it again, but he never threw it away either. When they cleaned out his house after he died, they found it in the back of his closet wrapped in plastic, hanging next to his son's Air Force dress uniform, both of them preserved like artifacts from a life that ended long before the body stopped breathing.